To start with, Pallavi, I'm so impressed with your latest book, Jakarta Tales. The new book, which has been published by HarperCollins, was released in 2020. But before all this, I would like to introduce everyone to the eminent guest of today. Sometimes I'm so amazed as to what technology can do to us and how well we are all connected in the Corona times too. Technology does wonders is visible. Today, our eminent guest, she joins all the way from Madrid, Spain, in the first author interaction of the year 2021 in our author interaction series, which we started last year in July. I'm Nita Nahija, and I'm the founder of Trends, which is the Forum for Art, Cultural, Social, and Literary Experiences. And I normally conduct my sessions with Shreya, who's a budding architect and a spoken word poetess. So let us all welcome Pallavi. Pallavi, in fact, is an award-winning foreign correspondent who has reported from all across China, Europe, Indonesia, and Japan. She's the author of several books of fiction and non-fiction, including the best-selling China memoir, and in fact, that is a Vodafone crossword award-winning book, Smoke and Mirrors, which is an experience of China. Her latest book is Jakarta Tales, which is the continuing adventures of very, very beautiful and very clever cats, Soya Bean and Tofu. Pallavi was selected by the World Economic Forum as a 2014 Young Global Leader, and she has also won the 2007 Prem Bhatia Memorial Prize for Excellence in Political Training, Political Reporting for her dispatches from China. Pallavi was, in fact, a Reuters Fellow at Oxford University. She was also a Bain's trust member of the IMT-based think tank, the Evian Institute. Pallavi has her first-class degree from Delhi University, our very own St. Stephen's College, then Oxford University and the London School of Economics and the University of South Carolina. Welcome, Pallavi. What an absolute pleasure and honor to have you with us today.
Thank you so much. I just would love to wish everybody Happy New Year as well from here in Spain. And thank you very much, Nita and Shreya, for inviting me to be part of this author interaction today.
This is absolutely a pleasure. The new book, as I mentioned already, has been published by HarperCollins, released in December 2020, is already making a lot of waves. And it's a humorous and poignant snapshot of contemporary Indonesia that will resonate with anyone who's loved a pet. In fact, I have recently become a pet parent and I can really very much relate to it. So over to you, Pallavi, to tell us a little about the book, and then we carry on with our conversation.
So a little bit about the book. As the subtitle says, it's the continuing adventures of Soya Bean and Tofu, which of course implies that it's continuing from something. And what it is continuing from is the first book that I wrote in 2010, so about a decade ago now, that had these two cats as the protagonists. And the name of that book was Chinese Whiskers, and that was set in Beijing, the capital city of China. Now, I have spent the last 15 years traveling across the world and living in many different parts of the world. China was one of them, where I lived for 7 years, and Indonesia, where the capital is Jakarta, I also lived in for 4 years. I have been a foreign correspondent, as you so kindly pointed out in your introduction, for most of this time. And as a result, I was reporting on the politics, the economy, the changing societies of all of these countries in Asia as well as in Europe. And I think that I realized that there were fascinating things to really learn about these places. And one way in which you could bring to light some of the kind of contemporary issues that were facing them would be through the point of view of pets, of animals, because they have this absolutely brilliant inside-outside perspective, where on the one hand, they are outsiders to human society and therefore end up seeing human society through a very special lens that can be very illuminating, because they can see human foibles in a way that humans often cannot themselves. But at the same time, they are also insiders because they are living inside the house. They are privy to conversations that are going on around them. And so, it was a way of really illuminating some of the larger topics that were relevant to the countries that I was living in, China and Indonesia, in these two particular ways, in this particular context. But through a sort of interesting, quirky lens of house pets that can get embroiled in larger adventures.
Absolutely. And in fact, it's a really a flawless and flowing narrative with all the emotions thrown in. And I remember last time a book which really touched me in a similar way was, though it's not similar in narrative at all, but the way it is flown was Bethlehem of Tiger Mother, if you've read that book. I loved it. And today, in fact, I was thinking about that book and I was also relating to your book, not in terms of any narrative, but the fact that your book also flows through. I mean, it's such a good narrative and it's lovely reading the entire book, at one stretch. That's what I did one night, as I told you. So tell me, I mean, to the uninitiated and people who've not read the book, because of the cover, one feels that the book is more for children. So tell us about the basic story and why should it be read by all the age groups? What about the audience range that you had in mind while writing this book?
Yeah, so in many ways, when I wrote the book, I didn't particularly have an audience in mind. I was writing it for myself and I was writing the best possible story that you could write. Now, when you have cats as protagonists, there's automatically a kind of innocence that comes through. Despite the fact that, unlike dogs, cats are definitely more sort of cynical observers. And particularly Soya Bean, who is one of the protagonists, tends to have quite a sort of grown-up, arch, sarcastic voice, compared to Tofu, who's far more sort of innocent, although wise in her own way. So there is a sort of childlike aspect to it, but I think we must always remember that fables are traditionally stories that have a moral paradigm at the center and have have animals as protagonists, but they illuminate larger things about the world and how we as human beings inhabit the world, and the values that are important to us in this world as well. And therefore, I think that the fables are really stories for all age groups. They are things that work at a innocent level for children, and as you grow older, you can kind of unpack them and take away more from them. A lot of the issues that I address in both Chinese Whiskers and Jakarta Tales are actually taken from contemporary politics. I address a range of different issues, from corruption, from fake news, from religious polarization. At its heart, it's about accepting diversity and accepting plurality, and basically turning your face away from bigoted, racist notions of purity and heterogeneity, and embracing the diversity and plurality that there happens to be in every society. And I feel that these are really strong messages that resonate with all age groups. Now, how I tell the stories, like in Chinese Whiskers, for example, we begin with the birth or the sort of origin stories of Soya Bean and Tofu. And Soya Bean is this absolutely gorgeous orange fluffy cat who's a kind of middle class cat. He's born in an old courtyard house in central Beijing with a kindly grandmother looking after him. Whereas Tofu is a kind of scrappy, what I call a dustbin cat, born in a backyard to a large litter of kittens. And both of these cats serendipitously, by luck, end up getting adopted by this Waigoran family, a foreigner family, who I call Mr. and Mrs. A in the book. As the story progresses, there's several different plot strands. On the one hand, there is a mysterious virus that is spreading across the city. And I actually based this virus on the 2003 coronavirus 1.0, which was SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome. And I happened to live in Beijing during that time. And one of the things that happened during SARS was that animals, in particular cats, began to be blamed for spreading the virus. Now, eventually we discovered that possibly the origin of SARS was in civet cats, which is a kind of wild cat. But at the time, there was a lot of misconception about this. And there were vigilante gangs that were wandering around the streets of Beijing and other cities in China and rounding up stray cats and pet cats and actually even dogs, any kind of animals that they could lay their hand on, and taking them away to a not so happy end. So what happens in the book is, again, there's this virus, which I call Pingdu, that's spreading. Cats are being blamed. And one of the cats ends up getting kidnapped by this vigilante gang. In the meantime, the other cat, Soya Bean, who's gorgeous and fluffy and orange, he becomes a cat model for a brand of pet food called Maumi Deluxe. And eventually we find out that the pet food is contaminated with a chemical called melamine. Once again, this particular incident is taken from real life. When I lived in China, we had a huge scandal where pet food and also baby milk and various other kinds of products were found to be contaminated. So, I mean, I wanted to tell you this to show you how I took real life incidents like corruption, like the contamination of products, like the coronavirus, and kind of then fed them into the story. And I also tried to kind of give a window into daily life in the hutongs, which were these kind of urban villages that existed within the broader cityscape of Beijing, and to kind of give a window into what daily life there looked like. And then this action sort of got resolved and moved to Indonesia. And I began to think about what would be the really big, like if I had to tell you what was the big issue in Indonesia today, I would really sort of bring religious polarization and fake news as the two most important things to watch out for over there as a reporter, as a journalist, the things that I was reporting on. Because, it is a country that is a Muslim majority country, and yet it is a democracy, which is quite rare in the world today. And it has free and fair elections, and it has a wonderful, vibrant political system for the last 20 years since the downfall of the dictator Suharto. But what we have been seeing in the last 5 or 6 years is the rise of religious extremism of all different kinds, of the suppression of minorities. All of this, of course, has mirrors around the world. It is not only something that has relevance to Indonesia, but has echoes and relevance across the world. And what is become a very potent force politically is social media, and also other kinds of technologies and the spreading of fake news through things like WhatsApp. So the cats in this instant get involved in a fake news network where I don't want to give away too many plot details. But the point, again, as I was saying, is that the stories can be read at multiple levels, because there are a lot of issues over there that are of relevance to the grown-up world. I think the language is relatively sophisticated and doesn't particularly dumb it down. But at the same time, I think the attractiveness of the cats and the fact that the stories are told through the animals is a fantastic way for children to join this conversation as well. And ultimately, the values at the heart of both the books, like I said earlier, are diversity, plurality, and embracing a multiplicity of identities, which remains very important for children and for adults today.
Fantastically said. And I think both these books everyone should read, because this is so interesting. And I'm sure our audience today is intrigued now to read, in fact, both the books, Chinese Whiskers as well as Jakarta.
They really are like a pair.
Yeah, they're a pair. In fact, and how your cats see through these political scenario is the most interesting one. In fact, though it's supposed to be a fiction, but there were so many times I was getting confused. I was mostly thinking it is your story, but then I was thinking, there was, I remember that, which was a little bit of a funny part when you go and look for Soya Bean in the other house in Jakarta Tales, and the way you're running and the rats are coming, and I was thinking, oh, was it happening? It is so weird. It's such a visual, when you're thinking about it, such a visual delight. And so I'm sure, coming back to your point, I think all the age groups should read it.
Sunita, I have to tell you a secret. In Jakarta Tales, a rat is quite a hero in the book, right? Tikus.
Yes.
Now, the fact is that we did have a very large house in Jakarta, and very similar to the one that I describe in the book. And we did have rats coming up through the garden in exactly the same way that I described. And I have to tell you that I have a huge phobia of rats. I absolutely absolutely detest rats. So it was quite a challenge for me to make a rat into a hero. And, I think, again, that was one of the ideas, the fact that, even the things that we think we detest, that we think are ugly and horrible and filthy and reviled, to try to find a way to have sympathy for them and to try to put yourself in the shoes even of a rat. For me, it was quite a big challenge to actually discover a rat with a golden heart, as I do in the book. But that again comes back to the themes of, trying to actually develop empathy and bridges with people or animals or categories out there in the world that we consider to be horrible, disgusting, or other a priori, without actually getting to know too much about them.
In fact, it so happened that I went back to HarperCollins and I said, "Are you sure this is a fiction? I think this is."
Really?
Yeah. And it was like Mrs. and Mr. A, and I was relating to you, and I was thinking, no, I think it's more of an autobiography than fantastic book, I must say. So, coming back to, because we're talking so much about Indonesia and we're talking so much about Southeast Asia's biggest economy, which is Indonesia, and it continues to be a rising political power. So, do you think will we see it as getting a major role or greater role in world politics? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
yeah, absolutely. I actually personally think that Indonesia is possibly the most important, significant country that you've never heard of. Or, I mean, you obviously heard of it, but what I mean is that it significantly punches below its weight in the global imagination. When we think about the sort of big powers in the world, obviously we think about the US, we think about China, we think about India. Indonesia rarely kind of figures, but it's an extremely important country for various reasons. It's huge in terms of its size. It's made up of 17,000 islands. And if you kind of placed all those islands like that, it would stretch all the way from Ireland to the Caucasus. It has a significant population of about 275 million people. And it has, like I said at the beginning, it's a Muslim majority country, which is a very tolerant, very democratic, very modern country, which is very progressive, which has had free and fair elections since the downfall of the dictator in 1998, where until recently, at least, religion was not a huge factor. People were actually voting on the basis of the competence of the leaders and on the basis of development. It's an economically moderately developed society, and despite being a Muslim majority country, it has a significant number of minorities, all of whom are respected within the constitution, ranging from Christians to, of course, Hindus on the island of Bali as well. Very syncretic culture, very plural, and a great example, I think, of how to kind of form a unified country out of a multiplicity, out of a plurality, without letting it fracture. Along, say, European lines, where you had the Second World War and this paroxysm of violence, which then ended up breaking up former empires into countries where you had one religion, one language, one ethnicity. Apart from Indonesia, India is the other country which really stands against that, the idea that we can actually be many and at the same time be one. So, I thought that there was a lot of learnings for India. I thought India and Indonesia made very interesting comparisons, because we actually had a lot in common, and a lot between us was comparable. The more common comparison is India and China, and it is a comparison that I myself have often made. But in some ways, it's a bit like comparing apples and oranges. We are very different from China. But with Indonesia and India, I felt that many of the challenges we were facing, the relationship between the states and the center, environmental pollution, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, the sort of economic the challenges of infrastructure and attracting FDI, and at the same time, given a democratic system, given a very clamorous, loud landscape that includes, trade unionists and civil rights activists and active media and all of that. India and Indonesia actually had a lot that was in common and parallel. So I absolutely think that Indonesia has the potential and to punch much higher than it does currently. It is also a natural leader within ASEAN, of course. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of it going forward.
Absolutely. And the way it is coming up also in the garment industry, in fact, it has been one of the biggest examples of how a smaller country, and we need to take a lot of lessons from them, how they are maintaining and how they are managing their economy. Do you think books like Chinese Whiskers and Jakarta Tales, they bring out the tourism of the individual countries that they are set in? Did you have that also in mind? Because it's quite, the background, the playground, everything else revolves around the country they are set in. So, what is your feel about that? So, do you
So the
think more?
idea wasn't specifically to promote tourism or anything like that. However, these are both countries, China and I think that's unusual for an Indian. For many Indians have a very negative conception of China for various reasons, with the border and political issues influencing possibly their idea. But for me, both China and Indonesia were countries that I fell in love with, and I felt were eye opening, because as an Indian of a particular background, I kind of grew up with a very Western orientation. I spoke English, and I had read, English writers, and the movies I watched were mostly Hollywood movies. And so, when you travel to the West, or you travel to Europe, you travel to the US, there was a sense of deja vu. I mean, you already knew these places. But when you traveled east and you went to places like China and then further east in Southeast Asia, it was firstly a blank canvas, and I didn't know what to expect. But I was extremely interested with how familiar, in many ways, these places felt, much more familiar than I had expected, because I knew so little about them. So, there was this kind of blank spots in our education or in our mental map. But when I actually went there, they felt like cousins, civilizational cousins. In Indonesia, of course, I think the greatest similarity is that they have the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are very intertwined in their culture. So the names of people, the names of shops, our local mall was called Dharma Vangsa Square, and it was based on Yudhishthira, and they had Yudhishthir's, Indonesian nized paintings of Yudhishthir and of the Pandava brothers all over. There's of course that. But there's also, like I was saying, a kind of rhythm to life, which is punctuated by the call of the azan, by prayers, by rituals, by a kind of spirituality which is there in everyday life, by the sort of familial ways in which we address strangers. In both China and in Indonesia, you call everybody either auntie, uncle, nani, dada, dadi. You have those particular words. So in Chinese, you say ai instead of auntie, and in Indonesia, you say pa and ibu, which is actually means father and mother, but you say that from instead of Mr. and Mrs. to
Yes, yes.
everybody. So just those kind of familial connections, and they're very they're just very resonant when you are an Indian. And I certainly feel that I want to kind of tantalize readers by these countries. I want to kind of give them an evocative experience where they can literally smell the frangipani in the gardens, for example, in Jakarta, or hear the goldfish vendor on the bicycle as he or she cycles through the hutongs, smell the coal briquettes going up in the winter in China. So I did want to give a glimpse into these countries and all their beauty and attractiveness. So, like I said, tourism was not the main thing behind it. But if I could encourage people or readers to open their hearts to countries and to cultures that they perhaps haven't had a familiarity with before, then for me, that would be a great job, that I would have achieved a goal.
Absolutely. In fact, in Chinese Whisper, you mentioned this before, but I'll still like to come back to that. Your love of Beijing's Hutong lifestyle is pretty transparent. In fact, I think you like the Hutong lifestyle, and I'm sure a lot of people will like to know what attracted you to this particular lifestyle and what made you set it as a background for Chinese Whiskers.
Whiskers. Yeah, it's a pun on Chinese whispers, so it's easy to get the two confused. You know, the hutongs, I guess one way of trying to describe them would be like old Delhi, but in a much more spruced up, not spruced up because they are not spruced up, but imagine them being less crowded. I would say less crowded and much cleaner. Okay, so but it's you know how that would be the heart of the old city of a capital that has a long history. The hutongs were very much that to Beijing. They used to be this warren of alleyways in about a 2 kilometer radius of the center, which was the Forbidden City, the great imperial palace where the Emperor of China would sit. And in these hutong neighborhoods that surrounded the Forbidden City, you had grand Haveli type places that were called Sakhayuan, which literally is like a courtyard. So like Havelis again in many parts of India, they would have an open courtyard in the center of the house, and then the rooms would be arranged around that courtyard. And you know, these were absolutely beautiful, and there were various aesthetic traditions that they followed. Like every courtyard would have a pomegranate tree usually in the center, and you know, facing south, and so on. These were these, you know, absolutely grand, gorgeous mini palaces, like mansions, where noblemen and rich merchants and so on would live. But in 1949, China had a communist revolution, and a communist government came to power. And one of the consequences of that was that all the land was appropriated by the state, by the government. And the hutongs were, the old courtyard houses were taken over and converted into workers' dormitories. They were basically given to state-owned enterprise work units, and then they were converted into kind of slummy mass accommodation for workers. And that's how they lived. So, you know, these grand houses became very dilapidated and kind of split up into small, small rooms. And as time went by, they became very unattractive places, kind of like slum-like. But then you had the reforms of the 1980s. And by the time I moved to Beijing, it was 2002, and you had begun to have a small renaissance in the hutong neighborhoods, and some of them were being repurposed. You know, again, imagine if you are looking at a Delhi context, somewhere like Chandni Chowk or whatever, being, you know, restored to its old glory. But here it was quite organic. You began to get kind of hipster businesses that were opening a few boutiques, or you know, a cool coffee shop popping up in the middle, and Chinese people themselves beginning to think that perhaps there was some historical value to these old buildings, which for a long time had been ignored. And some of these old courtyard houses had escaped too much destruction, and they began to renovate them. And so my husband and I moved into one of these renovated ones, and, you know, to really kind of get a sense of what it was like to live not just in kind of an expat gated community on the suburbs of Beijing, but right in the heart of Beijing with ordinary people. Because while our house was renovated and very nice, our neighbors were really just ordinary, what we call Lao Bai Xing. It's kind of saying the average Joe on the street, you know. And I just fell in love. And, you know, it was very interesting for me. I think one of the inspirations for writing books with cats in the center came from that experience, because the hutongs were landscapes where animals were very much part of the environment. You had people who kept pet pigeons, you had little dogs yapping and running around. It was a very sort of communal area. You sometimes had urban foxes or weasels called huangshulang. You know, you could see them tiptoeing across the silhouettes of the tile roofs in the evening. And then you had stray cats that were climbing up on the trees. And so everywhere you looked, some people kept chickens, you know, there was just a lot of animals. And it was interesting to try to visualize or imagine this world through their eyes. I used to sometimes wonder how it is that they see us. And people lived cheek to jowl with the animals, you see. These were very cramped quarters for the most part. And that forced a lot of the life from inside the houses onto the streets. So, things were just being lived on the streets with the animals, with the people. And it made very fertile ground, I think, for the imagination.
I can visualize that because when I was in China, I went there at least twice and I saw a lot of domesticated pets, in
Yes.
fact, cats in China. So, what do you think? How do you explain this Chinese view towards cats? I mean, how do they consider, since we're talking about cats? So, I mean, how do you think they consider them? I mean, there must
Yeah.
be something with the.
So, I mean, I think cats have a slightly happier fate than dogs because they are not usually eaten. There's, of course, the Chinese themselves joke about it. They say that the Cantonese in particular eat anything with four legs as long as it's not a table, and anything that flies as long as it's not an aeroplane. Dogs are eaten, particularly in the winter, because they are considered to be very good in protein and a warming kind of food. One thing I did discover about this whole dogs, because I'm saying this because people ask me a lot about, oh, is it really true that people eat dogs in China? But one thing I discovered that was interesting, and I bring that out in Chinese Whiskers as well, is that the Chinese do categorize dogs into two different types. And there is the type which is called Caiko, and Caiko literally translates as vegetable dog. And those are dogs that are bred and sort of grown to be eaten. They tend to be quite large, they have a lot of meat, and they are not seen as pets. They are seen as like people around the world see cows or sheep or goats or chickens or whatever, something that is being brought up to be eaten and slaughtered at some point. And then they have pets, and the pets tend to be much smaller dogs, like Pekingese dogs, and the smaller variety that people keep at home. And I think there'd be very few Chinese who would eat those or in any way consider them to be food. So they kind of see the two categories of dogs as very different. Anyway, but cats, domestic cats, don't really kind of come into this at all. They're very, very rarely eaten, although there have been some cases, for example, of the civet cats, which is why we think that SARS kind of entered the human body through the eating of civet cats. But domestic cats or house cats are not eaten at all. However, they tend to be sort of inside outside. Very few people actually domesticate them. They're kind of cats that roam around the cityscape and then kind of come in just to eat. People will feed them, but they have this inside outside life again, which I think makes them very fascinating as commentators. And cats have had, in folklore, they've often had a very interesting role in Chinese folklore, kind of like the wise fox in Indian, Jataka tales, which by the way, Jakarta tales is a pun on, and how you have the wise fox. And so in Chinese traditional folk tales as well, you often have cat figures, which are wise spirits. And so they also have a semi-spiritual role to play in traditional Chinese culture.
Yeah, in a way, much respected than our dear dogs. So, so you lived in Beijing. In fact, we've had Mr. Anand Krishnan as one of our authors. He came and we discussed the book India's China Challenge. And you've also lived in Beijing for almost 7 years during a period of dramatic change. So what mostly, in fact, a lot of people knowing that you've been in China and China is so prominent right now in all our minds, we would like to know what really surprised you about Chinese. What did you feel, about them? And since you were there for 7 years, and what is your one impression about them? Which is
I think my one impression about them is that there is no one impression, that they are far more multiple and far more diverse than I had imagined them to be. In my mind, they were quite a monolith. They would be kind of robotic, and there was this authoritarian government that was telling them what to do, and everybody was listening, and just like robots performing whatever they were told to do. And I didn't find this to be true to reality at all. I found the Chinese Chinese to be quite a fun-loving, humorous bunch. I think I did not expect them to have a sense of humor, but I actually thought that they had a raucous sense of humor. Now, I think one problem is the language, because I learned Chinese and I speak Chinese. I'm a Chinese speaker, so that makes makes them much more accessible. The whole culture much more accessible than it might be from the outside, when it can seem and feel much more inscrutable. But I found the Chinese reveling in chaos, often not listening and trying to find loopholes and different, ways of avoiding the rules, as it were. And in fact, when I also lived in Japan for 4 years, just before moving from Spain, I think Japan was much closer to that stereotype of, intrinsically very disciplined society. Whereas the Chinese were, more fun-loving, quite chaotic, and quite funny. I think much funnier than I had expected them to be. Yeah, there was at that time there was a positive, more or less a positive reception towards towards Indians. The border war played almost no part in the popular imagination. I'm talking about 2002, 2003. There's been a lot more resurgence of nationalist feeling in recent years, I believe, and because of problems on the border between India and China, this could have changed. But when I was there, the focus was far more than sort of political or anything to do with war or border, was Hindi movies, particularly Raj Kapoor movies were extremely popular. They had been all dubbed into Chinese, but people knew the lyrics in Chinese by heart of movies like Avara Hoon. I had taxi drivers singing it to me. I remember going into the hutongs, and some of the people who were just sitting out there on the stools, as I walked by, would start singing Avara Hoon. And talking about Raj Kapoor, who's called Ladza in Chinese. And I think there was also an overwhelming conception of India being a Buddhist country. There was ignorance of Hinduism. Everybody had been told that Buddhism came from India, which is a very strong and civilizational influence on China. And I think the idea there was very much still that we were Buddhists. So, I would get a lot of people who would kind of bow down to me and say, Lord Buddha. It was quite hilarious. But they were friendlier, funnier, more open than I had expected.
Coming from you, and you're an expert, you've stayed there, and you've done one of your best books based on that, Smokes and Mirrors. I think it is very valuable for all the viewers, and you've given us such beautiful, it gets us to know China better, I would say. And coming back to my last question, because there are people waiting for in the interactive round, is that, what are your next plans? I mean, we've had 2 books now on cats. So are you going back to nonfiction? What is it going to be like?
So I do have a nonfiction book that's coming out. It will be out in the summer of this year. And it's a book that's called Orienting, an Indian in Japan. And it's similar to Smoke and Mirrors in some ways, in that it's a snapshot of contemporary Japan, but told through a kind of comparative framework, one of India and 2 of China. I kind of triangulate the 2. And I look at Japan thematically. I break it into, I think, 9 or 10 chapters. And I look at themes like aesthetics and religion, cleanliness, politics, and so on, and bring a mixture of autobiography, analysis, and anecdote. I call them the 3 A's. So, I kind of bring in my own experiences as a reporter and tell the stories behind the stories that I reported on. And try and bring Japan to life, because that, again, is a fascinating culture and a kind of missing part of the Asian puzzle. If you look at India, China, and Indonesia, like I have through my books, Japan is the other great country that's kind of been missing from this jigsaw puzzle. And that's what I've been working on most recently.
We will definitely look forward to it, because I'm sure it is going to be one of the rare books on Japan coming from you, who's stayed there, who's reported from there. I'm sure no other person can be as much of an expert than you. And I can't stop asking you about these illustrations that you have in the book. This is the book we have been talking about, Jakarta Tales. And before this, you must also read Chinese Whiskers. I got the name right this time. And the lovely illustrations. I mean, I'm fascinated. So who's been designing these They're very
So it's a
relevant.
young illustrator called Aryama Somaji, and she was
Okay.
discovered by our publisher, HarperCollins. And Chinese
Okay.
Whispers has actually been rejacketed because the original book was published several years ago.
Yeah.
But they redid the illustrations to kind of match the two books together so they can be companion volumes. And I have to say that I think she's done an absolutely brilliant job. I've been blown away by them. And they're lively, they're clever, they're quirky, they're funny, really lovely illustrations. And they've also captured something of the spirit of my cats, because I sent her photographs of the real soya bean and tofu, and I feel that she's actually been able to bring something of the real cats into the drawings.
Yeah, that is what I was wondering, because Chinese Whiskers, I think, came in 2013 or
Yeah.
2011. And now they look so much relatable.
Yes,
Both the
it's been rejacketed. So they've redone the illustrations to match the two.
That's a great idea. And it's a great book. I'm sure all of us who've not read, I've read Jakarta Tales. I still have to read the Chinese Whiskers, and I'll do that very, very shortly. I think we'll have to go to the interactive round. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. This
Hi,
is such an
Shreya.
hi. How are you? This is such an
Good, thank
interesting
you.
session to listen to you and your cats. I'm so curious to actually meet them now. We have three books which Ma'am and HarperCollins have been very grateful to lend to us. So we'll be giving them away after a short quiz. So I'll ask one question now. To start with, how many countries have the real soya bean and tofu lived in?
When did you realize, this is by Diya Neja, when did you realize that you're ready to be published for your first book? Did you face any difficulties in finding a publisher? And did you hire an agency for representation? I think this is a very, very important question, because there are a lot of people here today who've been wanting to write books.
Yeah, so my first book was published in 2008, and I really wrote it over 2007. At the time, I was the China bureau chief for the Hindu newspaper, and I had been writing extensively on the country and traveling across the country for maybe 3 or 4 years. And you know, India and China was rising in importance globally, and particularly the bilateral relationship was also becoming very important. But we were in this strange situation where I was only one of two or three Indian journalists who was actually based in the country, and I think I was the only one at the time who spoke Chinese. You know, it was extremely important territory to be covering, but in some ways, virgin territory. Nobody else was doing it, I had a lot of people over the years say to me, "Are you doing a book? Are you doing a book?" And I remember thinking, "No, I'm not doing a book," because I had not set out to do a book, and I had no sort of project in mind. And I always thought that when you were going to do a book, you needed to have a kind of a theme, in the sense, for example, say following the footsteps of a monk, and then, you know, doing that journey yourself and writing about it, or having something very specific in mind. And I didn't. I'd just been writing about so many different things about China. You know, people kept coming back to me, and publishers kept asking me as well, actually, because there was so much interest in the country. And I realized that although I hadn't been thinking about writing a book, I had been writing very broadly and extensively about the country. And if I looked at all the material I had gathered, I could arrange it thematically to actually present a very holistic snapshot. And that what I brought to it was not just the material, but also my perspective as an Indian, because the way that an Indian observes China and interprets what one is seeing is quite different from that of a Westerner. And most of the books that we had in English out there about China, and there were a lot at the time, were really told from a Western perspective, and Indians were then reading that, but we had very little that was actually looking at China and interpreting China from an Indian perspective. And so I ended up using all the material that I had from the reportage I had over the years, sort of extracting the different themes, and so it was an act of organization, and then it was an act act of weaving my story into it as well, because when you're a reporter, you are not in the piece, you're only talking about other people and other facts. But here I also told my story, and so I arranged it chronologically from, you know, the story of a young girl as a 26-year-old landing up in Beijing, not speaking the language, my adventures teaching in a university over there, and then sort of expanding gradually into reporting. I was very lucky and I did not have any problems finding a publisher, I think because the topic was China, which was very hot and continues to be. And it was HarperCollins actually, and I have stayed with them mostly, apart from one book that I wrote on Europe with Penguin. The rest of my books have all been published with HarperCollins, and I've been very lucky. With Chinese Whiskers, I got an agent in New York called Sterling Lord Literaristic, and they helped me to find publishers in other countries. So Chinese Whiskers, for example, was translated into Dutch and also into Italian, and it also was published in America, and this was all done through the agent. And my agents also found me an American publisher, Macmillan, for my book on Europe. So I mean, I think if it's possible to get an agent, it's very useful, particularly in a context in which you don't have personal contacts. If you have your own personal contacts, say, you know, you're Indian, you know somebody, you can still kind of manage. But if you want to try to go global, I think it becomes very important then to work through an agency.
Very, very valuable tips. We move on to the next question, and we have Rishika Batra. She's a biotechnologist and she's from NUS Singapore.
So yeah, first of all, a wonderful session. I really enjoyed listening to you.
Thanks,
I
Rishika.
wanted to ask that what exactly drew you towards writing? Like, how did you start out and what did you do exactly? Like, what drew you exactly?
I think being a reader, I was always a reader from the time that I was very young. And I also enjoyed writing. It's something I tell my kids. You look like one of my kids. You probably only a little older than mine. But what you know, we grew up in a very different world. And I think I had very little in terms of entertainment in my life. I had no video games, and I had no mobile phone, and you know, we didn't have even 24-hour television or anything like that. And in many ways, writing for me was leisure. It was entertainment. The act of creating, the act of imagining, the act of writing a story, the act of writing a poem was something I did almost to alleviate boredom. You know, when there's not much else to do and what you've kind of got at your disposal is pen and paper, you end up using it. And so, you know, as a child, it was something that I just loved. It was what I passed the time with, and I you know, found it extremely enjoyable, just as I also enjoyed very much reading. So that was the twin. I mean, I think reading and writing are really twins, and so it was something that I think I was attracted to from a very early age, and I sort of credit being surrounded by books as well for that.
Okay.
Very right. And,
I think before we move on to the next question, I'll just ask one more question for the quiz. So what was ma'am's first job? Any questions?
Dr. Divya Taneja, she's a homeopath and she's a big book lover, I would say. Yes, hi Divya.
Hi, it was a pleasure talking to you, listening to you. And,
Thank you, Divya.
And it's great the kind of life you've had across the world. So my question is, what is your take-home message to people who are fueling this anti-China sentiment at this point of time? It's really great over the past couple of months that we are seeing. So what's your take-home message for these people about life and people in China?
So disappointing, isn't it? And unfortunately, it's not just anti China sentiment in India. There's anti India sentiment in China, and there's anti all kinds of sentiment all over the world. And you know, I think a lot of my work is about trying to deconstruct this anti. What does that mean when you're sort of against people and against cultures? Why is it necessary to be against something just to be proud of your own things? You know, or why can we not be more than just one thing? Why can't we be this and that rather than this against that? Yeah, I mean, my question, my message to people who are anti-China is like, instead of being anti-China, try to be pro-India. And being pro-India does not mean being anti-China, but it means being as strong and as successful as we can be as a country. And how do we achieve that? And if that means looking and learning from China, China has achieved some remarkable things, and it's like I said at the beginning, it's not only because it's an authoritarian country where you have somebody with a danda that forces people into doing things. You have authoritarian countries all over the world, and most of those authoritarian countries have failed miserably and have ended up into kleptocracies that have done very badly. What is it about China? It's not just being authoritarian. There's more to it. So that you can also learn a lot from other cultures, I think what's important for Indians in general is to be open to learning about other places. Learn languages, read. These are all tools of developing empathy, and rather than just chest thumping and talking about our men on the border, which is wonderful, and I'm very grateful for our men on the border. But also trying to kind of open our hearts, open our eyes, open our imaginations to other parts of the world, not just China, not just Indonesia, the world. I mean, we live on one planet, and I think it's a wonderful, diverse, interesting, exciting place we should all take advantage of.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think you represent a true global perspective. We've already covered 5 countries. Which country is Jakarta Tales set in?
Yeah, we have Mamta Sharma. She's an English educator and very frequent on all the author interactions. Mamta, please.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
It is absolutely an honor to be able to listen to all these countries and the tales which you've written, from a young global leader to writing Jakarta Tales. I think I am so fascinated by this shift from writing about India, China, Japan, and other countries and coming to cats. How did this shift happen? I have been, all this while I've been just trying to figure out the way you are trying to move from one thing to another. It is so complex, talking about what India demands and what India deserves, to writing about cats and their relationship with humans. This is something which is taking me to actually read a couple of your books. I haven't been fortunate enough though, but I am going to. This is my take home message actually, that I'm going to read and delve in myself into reading all these things. But something which I really want to know is, how did this happen? Talking about such political issues, and then coming to human relationships, and especially talking about parenting as well. You brought babies. There is a book,
Babies and bylines.
Bylines, something which I'm really getting fascinated a little too much. But then how is this happening? What Dia asked right in the beginning, and another question, somebody asked that what drew you to writing? But it's not only writing, it's writing and adorning multiple hats, at the same time. So how is this oscillation happening? What is taking
In
you?
some ways, it's a bit like, so from a very young age, I was talking about how I used to write when I was a child. I used to write a diary, and a lot of it was essentially trying to make sense of the world around me. It was my thoughts. Yeah, you think you're very sort of grand and grown up as a 9-year-old writing a diary, but as I've had the privilege to live in, work in, and report on many different parts of the world, cultures, and so on, learn many different languages as well, I'm constantly having thoughts. I mean, I'm sort of looking at things and thinking about them. And when I think about them through the multiple lenses that I've acquired through life. One of them also happens to be that of a mother. One of them happens to be that of a pet owner. One of them happens to be that of an Indian. One of them happens to be that of a woman. I mean, all of us have these multiplicity of identities within us, and they all kind of give us different frames of references for looking at, observing, and analyzing what we're watching. And I think all of these books in different ways are kind of coming through those filters. And, I think it just goes to show that we are not just one kind of person. We are a multiplicity within us. And I try to give expression to whatever at that moment in my life is the one identity that's taking priority over others. So, Babies and Bylines came at a time when my children were very young, and I was struggling a lot with issues of motherhood and working and moving and global parenting with kids with multiple identities, and a lot of issues of sort of working out myself. And so instead of just working them out internally, I kind of put them on paper and sort of worked them out for a larger audience and shared them with other people as well. So I think it's just, a lot of it has just been working through my life. And I tend to think in stories. I tend to experience things in stories. Like whenever something happens to me, it is a story. I mean, and that's the fact for all of us. Actually, our
Yes,
lives are
true.
one big story, right?
Yes.
Becoming a mom, when we travel, any sort of experience that happens to us has the potential of a narrative in there. And I think I just
Yes, I
end up
agree.
making those narratives explicit.
Thank you for this. It is absolutely inspiring. I am.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear that, and I do hope you can get hold of a couple of the books.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do. Thank you.
But I have to say, I occasionally write, and I was going through sort of like a blog. I've not been able to write for a long time, and I'm so inspired to go back to the writing desk right now. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And I'd love to read some of your writing at some point
Oh
going
yes,
forward.
of course. I would love to, hear your opinion on some of them. So I'll just announce the quiz winners. Answered the fastest was Ayush Jain, and he answered correctly 4 out of the 5 countries. So how many countries have the real 2 cats lived in? So that would be 5: China, Belgium, Indonesia, Japan, and Spain. And I think he
They
replaced
didn't get Belgium, right? Because we didn't talk about Belgium.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So he replaced
Yeah.
Belgium with
I was
India.
expecting that.
But I think that was a
But
good guess.
Good guess.
Ayush, I must mention, has logged in from US.
Oh, fantastic. Wonderful. That's quite early in the US.
And he's a regular with us. He's been joining in. Shreya, the second winner, please.
Yes, second was Arundhati Gupta, and she guessed that your first guest, I think she knew already, that your first job was reporter at NDTV in New Delhi.
Okay. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And a lot of other people said you were a journalist, a reporter in China, editor, teaching. So all of that.
That was my second job. Yeah. Yeah.
All of that, but the first one was that. And the third is actually, the answer for the third question was Jakarta Tales. For where Jakarta Tales was set in, that was in Indonesia. And, okay, then Shweta Jain, I think.
She's also a journalist. She works with
Okay.
BBC. Yeah,
Perfect.
that's lovely.
I think, yeah.
I think it
So,
was a very, very enriching session. And thank you, Pallavi, for an extremely value-add session. I'm sure most of us here have felt enamored by your experience. And I hope to see you again on this forum with your Japan book.
Absolutely. In a few months. It would be
Yeah,
my
you-
pleasure. Thank you very much to both of you for hosting this interaction today.
Thank you. And I really thank HarperCollins for sponsoring the books.